Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, well, good morning, very early morning, I would say, to Professor Michael Renov and to those of us, of you who are joining us in different time zone, which is magically what Zoom is making possible. Please excuse a slightly lengthy intro because I think it's a well-deserved one. I'm very delighted and honored to have with us here today Michael Renov, Professor of Critical Studies, Haskell Wexler Endowed Chair in Documentary, and Vice Dean for Academic Affairs at University of Southern California. Professor Renov is a distinguished scholar of documentary studies whose teaching and research interests include documentary theory, autobiography in film and video art and activism, and representations of the Holocaust. Professor Renov is the author or editor of several books on documentary film, including Theorizing Documentary, which is a groundbreaking anthology that helped establishing the field of documentary studies in 1993, Collecting Visible Evidence from 1999, and The Subject of Documentary from 2004, which is still the most rigorous account of personal nonfiction cinema. He is also the author of Wartime Woman, Representation and Ideology, co-editor of Resolutions, Contemporary Video Practices, The Sage Handbook of Film Studies, and Cinema's Alchemist, The Films of Peter Forgach. In 1993, Professor Renov co-founded Visible Evidence, a series of international and highly interdisciplinary documentary studies conference that have to date been held on 5 continents. And this is where we've actually first met and keep meeting every year, like in Miluim, but more fun. He's one of the 3 general editors for the Visible Evidence book series at the University of Minnesota Press. Now I think moving to Columbia, which has published 27 volumes on various aspects of nonfiction media since 1997. In addition to curating documentary programs around the world, he has served as a jury member at documentary festivals, including Sundance, Silver Docs, the Buenos Aires International Independent Film Festival, Doc Lisboa in Portugal, and many more. Professor Renov has taught graduate seminars and workshops at the University of Stockholm, Central European University in Budapest, Jordan for the Royal Film Commission, and Cyprus, and of course, here, back in 2012, it's been 8 years now, can't believe that, but Professor Renov has taught in our school an unforgettable graduate seminar on documentary and the avant-garde. Those who attended it, including myself, still, I think, pack their teaching syllabi with titles that Professor Renov introduced us to by wonderful filmmakers like Peter Forgach, Jay Rosenblatt, and Susana de Sousa Diaz, for example. While we were not able to host Professor Renov last year in our international colloquium, like we often do every other year, and hope to do this year, we are very lucky to have him with us here today. Professor Renov's talk is titled The Autobiographical Supplement, Expanding and Facilitating Cinematic Stories of the Self. So please, Professor Renov.
Thank you so much, Ohad. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Let me begin by expressing my appreciation for this invitation to speak with you all today. It's an opportunity to leave my house, if only virtually, and for a couple of hours, and to resume a conversation with some dear friends at the Steve Tisch School of Film and Television at Tel Aviv University. These are friends with whom I've been in intermittent dialogue for many years now, as Ohad says, since the first International Colloquium on Cinema and Television Studies in 1996, a dialogue deepened, again, as Ohad said, in 2012 by my experience of teaching a condensed grad seminar in documentary and avant-garde film for the school. For me, every chance to visit Tel Aviv University, even virtually, is a return home and an instance of aliyah. But this time I feel the need for spiritual uplift all the more urgently. For 10 months now, we've all been forced to withdraw, to limit contact with others except through such platforms as Zoom, to live our lives at a very different pace and in a different key. For many of us, these months have brought terrible loss. All of us have been witness to a withering away of a tangible public sphere and the pleasures of in the flesh, social and intellectual engagement. A recent series of Zoom sessions organized in lieu of what would have been the 27th edition of the Visible Evidence Conference in Frankfurt reminded me of what we've all been missing. Yes, many of us are teaching and meeting on Zoom, as we are now. It has its benefits, as we see today, namely the space-binding capacity of digital media that allows us to commune with one another from around the globe. But it's impossible to replicate the spontaneity of live debate, the fleeting conversations in the halls, during the breaks and over lunch. We're all missing the sparks that ensue with human contact and the intellectual stimulation that rooms full of people talking about the same ideas can bring. I hope this presentation will provide at least some measure of dialogue during the Q&A. I begin by sketching out the contours of this presentation by way of a question posed. What exactly do I have in mind when speaking of the autobiographical supplement? My point of departure for these remarks is both theoretical and personal. I'm on the one hand inspired by Jacques Derrida's rigorous investigation of the logic of the supplement in his Of Grammatology, a task he undertakes by way of a close reading of the works of Claude Lévi-Strauss and especially Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I first read this book in the 1970s. Many of its formulations have remained with me ever since. As my focus turned to the study of documentary discourse in the 1980s and 1990s, I felt the cogency of Derrida's critique of metaphysics for the study of the documentary film, an attitude reflected in my introduction to theorizing documentary, published in 1993. Yikes. Let's see. How do I do this? There we go. In Of Grammatology, Derrida offers up what he calls an urgent analysis of a particular sort of surplus, the supplement, that violates the fixed categories and dualisms of classical philosophy, among them presence, absence, spoken word, writing, inside, outside, soul, body. His reading of Rousseau is urgent because it announces a fundamental deconstruction of the history of metaphysics, which always assign the origin of truth in general to the logos, and is thus what he calls, quote, the history of truth, of the truth of truth. Derrida attacks this logocentrism as the debasement of writing and its repression outside full speech. Writing for Derrida signifies inscription, trace structure, and thus the durable institution of a sign. His efforts are aligned in the 1960s with the new iconoclasm in the field of semiotics, beyond Saussure and Peirce. As Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak reminds us in her remarkable translator's preface to Of Grammatology, quote, word and thing or thought never in fact become one. The sign marks a place of difference. This articulation of the signifying process is entirely at odds with one central strand of thought within film studies, that derived from André Bazin, whose very moving account of photographic ontology is premised on faith and desire. Quote, only a photographic lens can give us the kind of image of the object that is capable of satisfying the deep need man has to substitute for it something more than a mere approximation, a kind of decal or transfer. The photographic image is the object itself, the object freed from the conditions of time and space that govern it, end of quote. Bazin's account is phenomenological, rooted in the special conditions of perception surrounding the photographic sign and in the belief it inspires, while Derrida's is rigorously skeptical, materialist, graphological. Such debates regarding the status and character of the cinematic sign have special relevance, I think, for documentary. Following Derrida and contra Bazin, we are encouraged to never mistake a sign for its referent or to assume a unicity of signifier and signified. This dictum is especially important for our understanding of the observational mode of documentary that aspires to the least mediated capture of the real. Derrida's writing of this period alerts us to the fundamental premise outlined by Spivak, attuned now to nonfiction film. The documentary sign marks a place of difference. Contrary to the Bazinian position, propped up by faith, the filmic sign as supplement is spectral. Quote, it is as if one fills a void. Although I cannot pursue the point here at any length, I would suggest that this spectrality resonates with the psychoanalytically grounded notion of the absent presence that characterizes the cinematic sign in Christian Metz's The Imaginary Signifier essay. Derrida's elevation of writing and his emphasis on the notion of difference also entails something like a negative theology, illustrated by the aforementioned stark contrast with Bazin's ontology aligned with the Jansenist strain of Catholicism. In the grammatology, Derrida challenges a received hierarchy whereby speech stands for pure presence, quote, the natural, primary, and immediate presence of sense to the soul within the logos, end quote. For those of us versed in Torah, think of those moments of divine speech in the text. When, for example, the terms of the covenant between God and his people Israel are announced at crucial junctures to the patriarchs or to Moses. In this recitation of the covenant, chanted in many synagogues around the world on Yom Kippur morning, Moses addresses the children of Israel for the last time. Divine intention, presence, is spoken through him. You stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God, which the Lord your God is concluding with you this day, with its sanctions, to the end that God may establish you this day as a chosen people and be your God, as was promised you and sworn to your ancients, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I make this covenant with its sanctions, not with you alone, but both with those who are standing here with us this day before the Lord our God, and with those who are not with us this day. Such passages as these occurring as written text, but intended to be chanted, given as speech, are moments of what Derrida would call absolute plenitude, meant to transcend time and space, offered in the future perfect, this will have been. Contrariwise, in of grammatology, theophany, manifestations of pure presence derived from religious doctrine or classical philosophy, are placed under erasure, a notion he borrows from Heidegger that renders a given term necessary but inadequate. In lieu of transcendence, pure presence, instead, the primacy of writing and of trace structure. That's the Derridian path. Now, Of Grammatology is but one of several books written by Derrida during a remarkably fertile period of the late 1960s. Indeed, 3 groundbreaking volumes were produced in 1967 alone: Speech and Phenomena, Writing and Difference, and Of Grammatology, which the author understood to inaugurate a science of writing cognizant of the inherited limitations of metaphor, metaphysics, and theology. These works constituted the founding principles of deconstruction, a term, by the way, that Derrida never liked or accepted. They constituted nothing less than a radical critique of the sign. This is not the place to delve more deeply into the presumed stakes of Derrida's project, except to say that his writings of the late 1960s, aligned with that of his contemporaries Lacan, Barthes, and Foucault, with whom he nonetheless had massive disagreements, were in their own way as revolutionary as the events taking place in the streets of Paris during that turbulent time. Unlike his contemporaries, however, Derrida was young, his late 30s, a Jew, and a North African immigrant with very poor job prospects, a situation that was to change only after his discovery by American scholars at Yale and elsewhere. It has always seemed to me that the field of documentary studies has much to gain from the lucidity of Derrida's critique of truth as the linchpin of Western metaphysics. But what are the supplement? Back to that. What are the supplement and filmic autobiography? The supplement is but one among many Derridian structures of radical critique or deconstruction, of which the most notable may be difference, or as he rewrites it, difference with an A, différence, a word that sounds the same in French as its everyday homophone. The term is meant to denote both differ and defer, inhabiting both spatial and temporal dimensions. Like difference, the supplement announces itself as a site of non-origin, which is to say, it is not the thing itself, it is something other, a surplus of meaning, separate but indivisible. As Derrida outlines it, the supplement is intrinsic to the very structure of the sign. A long quote from which I'm excerpting a few key points. Let's see. There is a fatal, this is Derrida speaking, there is a fatal necessity inscribed in the very functioning of the sign that the substitute make one forget the vicariousness of its own function and make itself pass for the plenitude of a speech whose deficiency and infirmity it nevertheless only supplements. For the concept of the supplement harbors within itself two significations whose cohabitation is as strange as it is necessary. The supplement adds itself. It is a surplus, a plenitude enriching another plenitude. But the supplement supplements. It adds only to replace. It intervenes or insinuates itself in the place of. If it fills, it is as if one fills a void. Compensatory and vicarious, the supplement is an adjunct, a subaltern instance which takes place. The sign is always the supplement of the thing itself. Whether it adds or substitutes itself, the supplement is exterior, outside of the positivity to which it is superadded. Unlike the complement, dictionaries tell us, the supplement is an exterior addition. So that's the end of that quote. A shorthand for this formulation of the supplement, as appealing as it is insufficient, would be the neologism complace. A seeming oxymoron, the supplement both completes and replaces, dislodges and overturns even as it enriches and makes fuller. Now recall that I said that the notion of the supplement appeals to me on theoretical grounds, but also personally. I have for a long time been fascinated by the autobiographical film, a cinematic category that occupies an elusive and even paradoxical space. Let me say at the outset that the terrain of autobiography is subjectivity itself. That multi-layered construction of selfhood, imagined, performed, and assigned. Understood etymologically, autobiography is composed of three principal parts: auto, a self, bio, a life, and graphy, a writing practice. What separates filmic autobiography from other cinematic storytelling practices is that, as an act of self-portraiture, the self is both source and subject of the discourse, thus inviting much speculation and debate as to how one might be both in front of and behind the camera, occupying a place that can move both inside and outside diegetic or scenic space. Here, I would simply allude to the many casuistries of such master practitioners as Chris Marker, Jonas Mekas, Chantal Ackerman, and David Perloff, to have us recall the myriad ways that the first person can be implied, implanted, resisted, and revisited through many formal and structural devices, including voiceover, the filmmaker's own voice or that of a surrogate, the use of mirrors, tripods, the mobilization of home movie footage containing the filmmaker, or the repetition of shots or icons associated with the artist that trigger memory, the filmmakers as well as our own, for example, Marker's cats. Derrida has written of these flourishes of the personal as signature effects, authorial watermarks, one could say. The multi-layered construction that is subjectivity, when figured as cinematic self-portraiture, conjures the strange and the necessary, as evinced by Derrida. Filmic self-inscription, riddled with paradox, may indeed function as the exterior addition. These are all phrases I'm borrowing from what we've already discussed briefly. The strange and the necessary, the exterior addition. In an essay entitled Autobiographies, spelled with an O-T-O, Derrida reflects on Nietzsche's Ecce Homo, which as an act of philosophical self-assessment, quote, affirms the value of dissimulation. I am double, writes Nietzsche. Therefore, I do not mistake myself, at least not yet, for my works, end quote. In this account, the autobiographical is the homonymic mask that leads the reader along the affiliated threads of a labyrinth. For his part, filmmaker Jonas Mekas has written about his efforts at cinematic self-portraiture in a manner, I believe, that reaffirms its character as exterior addition. Quote, what I faced was the old problem of all artists, to merge reality and self, to come up with a third thing. The third thing may be as good a label as any for the autobiographical supplement. I pause here to say more about the problems of naming. I have long preferred the notion of the autobiographical to that of autobiography, to use the term as a modifier rather than as a noun, and in so doing avoid pigeonholing such an elusive form. The autobiographical can be said to encompass a wide and nuanced range of filmic practices in ways that I've rather obsessively explored over the years. The modalities in question include the diary film, Mekas, Perlov, George Kuchar, the essay film, Godard, Mekas, Marker, domestic ethnography, Sue Friedrich, Alan Berliner, Jay Rosenblatt, and the video confession, Wendy Clark, Susan Mogul, Lynn Hirschman Leeson. Many examples could be mentioned as well, of course. The rubrics of autobiography have also been famously mimed, pastiched, and parodied in scores, if not hundreds of films, ranging from David Holtzman's Diary in 1967 to Hollis Frampton's Nostalgia and Cheryl Dunye's The Watermelon Woman. I've been thinking, writing, and teaching about subjectivity in cinema with special attention given the autobiographical for more than 3 decades now, mostly in the realm of the documentary film, although any examination of filmic self-inscription runs afoul of some foundational distinctions. For a start, is autobiography fiction or nonfiction? Surely no topic could be more fully mastered no textual performance more incontrovertibly knowable or true than the recounting of one's own life experience. But is one doomed to trope, aestheticizing, and fabulation in the telling of that tale? This seeming conundrum is repeatedly played out in the literary world. The memoir, a tremendously popular literary genre, has incited much debate over the years as commentators take issue with the extravagances and inaccuracies to be found in so many of these accounts of lives lived, battles fought, and loves lost. To complicate things, we know full well many personal memoirs are ghostwritten or co-authored. Do these volumes even belong in the nonfiction section at your local bookseller? The scandals caused by the faux memoir are legend, as in the case of James Fry's A Million Little Pieces, about the author's supposed struggles with substance abuse and rehabilitation, first published as a memoir, then after some very public accusations of literary forgery, republished as a semi-fictional novel. That is to say, literally reshelved in libraries and bookstores. Freie, in fabricating and embroidering, some said capitalizing on the near truth, had violated what literary critic Philippe Lejeune has called the Autobiographical Pact. That implied agreement between author and reader, in which the autobiographer promises to offer a veridical account of a life, coupling introspection with stringent truth-telling. The reciprocal of the author's pledge of good faith is the reader or viewer's investment of belief in the truth of the telling. The autobiographical pact is implicit but highly charged. Woe be to all who violate it, as James Fry discovered. Literary scandals and autobiographical pacts serve to remind us of the relatively high stakes for first-person films. Why? We are offered access to the interiority of another, someone we are unlikely to know, yet somehow we find ourselves interpolated by acts of self-disclosure. I think that's because the content of every autobiographical film is nothing other than subjectivity, a shared human condition. I would argue that we as spectators of these films are implicated in every act of self-interrogation. We are ushered into identification, not so much with the person as with the gesture or action, a quest for answers to the simplest of questions. Who am I? The who am I question has been much discussed in film and cultural theory as a source of the deep curiosity humans have for gazing upon or eavesdropping on others, even or especially those we access only through works of art. The notion of secondary identification in psychoanalytically based film theory argues that we are driven to see ourselves in characters presented to us on the screen. Identification of the sort I am suggesting for the autobiographical act is more a matter of a longing for agency, a desire for self-knowledge. Now, in his discussion of the mirror stage, psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan outlined the defining conditions for the early formation of identity or selfhood for the 6-month-old child. With its cognitive capacities outstripping its mirror skills, its motor skills, the child claims for itself an imagined unity as it gazes upon itself in the putative mirror. It is a gestalt, a mirage, or a phantasm that is encountered at this founding instant, rather than a unified, fully functional self. But the important point, writes Lacan, is that this form situates the agency of the ego before its social determination in a fictional direction, which will always remain irreducible for the individual. The word irreducible describes a founding dynamic, the situating, that is, of the agency of the ego in a fictional direction. In relation to a brief developmental phase, a stage occurring between the ages of 6 to 9 months, but that is nonetheless constitutive, or so he argues. Lacan was fond of choosing visual correlatives for the self-contradictory, enigmatic psychic structures he posited. One favorite was the Mobius strip, a structure whose non-orientable surface confounds notions of inside and outside. Roland Barthes, a frequent attendant at Lacan's seminars, states in his Roland Barthes par Roland Barthes, in the field of the subject, there is no referent, or elsewhere, the subject is merely an effect of language. Frantz Fanon's articulation of double consciousness, derived from W.E. Du Bois, further developed in Black Skin, White Masks, offers a racialized account of the inescapable fracturing of identity experienced by the colonized subject. All these formulations reiterate notions of instability, flux, and the critique of unified consciousness. Now, given all the troubling of the subject derived from philosophy and cultural theory, it should not surprise us that the autobiographical enterprise is riddled with uncertainty, contradiction, and contingency. I might even say that the autobiographical occupies a particularly precarious perch within the domain of nonfiction, in that it offers little by way of guarantee. Ontological and epistemological questions will always arise in relation to the documentary project writ large, but I see the autobiographical film as constituting something like a limit case for documentary discourse with regard to its veridical or truth-telling potential or impossibility. The autobiographical text models an acting out of that drive to decipher and untangle one's inner reality, which Freud has characterized as analysis interminable. For Freud, the unconscious, that which lies beneath consciousness, constituted what he called the greater part of psychic life, in the manner of the iceberg afloat in dark waters. Efforts to plumb those depths through cinematic acts of self-interrogation exert an attraction on us, despite the intractable challenges that project introduces. I turn now to some specific film texts to test out some of the ideas developed here. One such matter is the suggestion that the autobiographical film or literary memoir may in fact straddle the categories of fiction and nonfiction, as discussed. In Sarah Polley's Stories We Tell, 2012, the filmmaker daughter and scion of a well-known Canadian theatrical family sets out in pursuit of the truth of her patrimony and to unravel some secrets surrounding her late mother, Diane Polley, who may or may not have engaged in an extramarital affair of which Sarah may or may not have been the product. In Stories We Tell, Polley poses the who am I question quite explicitly, but that singular inquiry does not in any way exhaust the film's scope or purview. Polley also demonstrates that nuanced storytelling, well-rehearsed performance, one-on-one interviews, and scenes of reenactment, while powerful creative tools, are at odds with the delivery of an unvarnished truth. The truth of the text as genealogical knowledge turns out to be a powerful lure to spectatorship and imagination that provides an entry point to much more. In fact, Stories We Tell, far from offering resolution or reconciliation with the past, traces a collision course between past and present, fact and imagination, reflex and reflection, desire and delay. It is a testament to the film's powers, that audiences tend to lean into that collision. I think this is so because the filmmaker intuits and honors the labyrinth, emotional, familial, cyclical, into which she and we are plunged. Stories We Tell never shies away from the repercussions of its investigations. The destabilizing impact knowledge of family secrets can have on the subject filmmaker, or the potential for the dysfunction of one generation to be visited on the next. Does a stranger's brief love affair with a mother the filmmaker barely knew suffice to endow this man with a name father? Can Michael Polly, the man who raised Sarah, be summarily displaced by a man previously unknown to her? Can Sarah's siblings, brothers and sisters with whom she, the baby of the clan, is quite close, be blamed for withholding or repressing knowledge of the past capable of imploding the family? Is the obsessive interviewing of her father and siblings on camera any or all of the following? A search for truth, an expression of her affection, or perhaps of her greater cultural capital, a gesture of control, or an act of sadism? How can Sarah, an accomplished actress and metteur en scène in her own right, ever hope to take ownership of a story that played out prior to her birth, and in which all family members play vital roles? In the face of all these conundrums, Sarah opts to mingle poly home movie footage of Mother Diane with staged material of an actress playing the role of Diane. Here are some of the things both Dianes do at various moments in the amateur footage. Now, if we were in real time and face to face, I would show little clips and things, but I'm hoping many of you know this movie. So here's some of the things both Dianes do at various moments in the amateur footage interspersed throughout the film, or faux amateur footage dispersed throughout the film. Mug for the camera, take baby Sarah for a swim, frolic with her husband Michael, carouse at a bar with friends, perform on stage. In most of the footage, Diane returns the camera's gaze without apology. The material is meant to be evidential. After all, there's little else of Diane that remains. But evidence of what? The footage bespeaks a mother's devotion to her youngest child, Sarah, even while continuing to pursue a theatrical career with the vivacity echoed in the accounts of all interview subjects. But most of all, the footage reveals an intractable opacity. From my experience of teaching the film, I've noticed that audiences differ or when, or even if they catch on to the doubling of Diane prior to the credit roll. It would seem to be an obvious example of what Bill Nichols, in speaking of documentaries of reenactment, has called the body too many. That is, the introduction of a surrogate or an acted figure who doubles the absent subject in clear violation of documentary norms, in hopes of paying narrative or aesthetic dividends. The context of Nichols' body too many references to a documentary, Roses in December, a 1982 film that tells the story of 4 American missionaries, female missionaries in El Salvador, nuns in fact, raped and murdered by members of the El Salvador National Guard. That includes brief moments of reenactment that courted controversy. But here, in Stories We Tell, the Diane surplus, to borrow Derrida's notion of the supplement, that surplus is highly motivated. Audience members cannot be blamed for wanting more clues, more insights into the actions and motivations of the late Diane. The artist exercises her privilege to play with the possibilities of knowing and imagining through her casting, directing, and editing of images of an actress who is responsive to Sarah's every piece of direction, malleable to her creative whims. The artifice is revealed as the credits roll. The film pivots on the exposition of themes common to the autobiographical mode, but tailored to this particular brew of highly charged family investigation. Reflections on the vicissitudes of memory, the unknowability of the past, the volatility of passion, and the power of art to mourn, reshape, or reconcile loss. Controversial at the time of its release for its teasing violation of the norms of autobiographical facticity, Stories We Tell has much to teach us about the contested character of filmic autobiography. The account of a life it offers, which is to say, its rendering of the Sarah Polly origin story turns out to be less about origins than supplement. Its version of Sarah Polly-ness seems more than willing to jettison the false appeal of origins, offering instead a self-portrait that is vicarious, insinuating, duplicitous, in short, supplemental. Stories We Tell is the postcard that is unlikely to arrive intact at its destination, but instead satisfies itself with delay, deferral, partiality, even erasure, the Derridian gesture that crosses out the text even while allowing it to remain legible. Which is to say, stories we tell cannot possibly be counted on to deliver the goods, if by that we mean provide closure or an impression of reconciliation with the past. In the face of an impossible quest for origins, subtext of every autobiographical film, Stories We Tell displays instead a kind of narratological promiscuity. The film encourages us to reconsider the promise of autobiography as a fool's errand, doomed, if not to outright failure, at least to incompletion, self-deceit, and inadequacy. But my description strikes me as far too clinical, making stories sound more like a philosophical treatise than a film that won 24 awards at international film festivals and from film critic groups. The overwhelmingly positive critical reception of Stories We Tell, huge high mark on Rotten Tomatoes, shows that lucidity of thought need not sacrifice artifice or creativity. Though our basest narrative instincts may be thwarted by the film, there is pleasure to be found in the telling. Turns out, violating the autobiographical pact, if done with style, can be a survivable act. In what remains of my time, I would like to move to another dimension of the autobiographical supplement and the critique of origins. I'm referring to a special sort of slippage between the first person singular that we associate with every autobiographical gesture and that which is properly first person plural. I want to examine the often quite porous borderline between the I and the we. Again, I hope that what we have to say about the autobiographical film in this context will have something to tell us about the larger documentary project. I, we slippage of the sort I have in mind may be a cousin to that between I and you. All communicative acts or addresses can be said to offer an engagement seeking to intertwine the one telling and the one receiving. This semiotic encounter also entails an ethical dimension, as described by theologian Martin Buber. Quote, I require a you to become, becoming I say you. All actual life is encounter, end quote. For Buber, it is the relational that unlocks the world as we find it and on different spheres, from the relation to nature that, quote, vibrates in the dark and remains below language, to the second sphere, life with men and women, at which point relationality becomes manifest and enters language, and finally to the third and highest sphere, life with spiritual beings, in which, quote, we hear no you and yet feel addressed, end quote. For Buber, it is the third sphere that undergirds relationality at every turn. Quote, in every sphere, through everything that becomes present to us, we gaze toward the train of the eternal you. In each we perceive a breath of it. In every you, we address the eternal you. In every sphere, according to its manner, end quote. Relationality understood in this way marks a definitive return to metaphysics. Ethnographic filmmaker David McDougall has suggested something comparable in his writings on ethnographic filmmaking, a species of documentary in which representatives of diverse cultural coordinates encounter one another. He puts special emphasis on the encounter, for it is through the substantive engagement of self and other that a dialogue can be achieved through the film. The critiques of ethnography frequently remind us of its colonialist legacy, its origins in the unevenness of power and privilege attached to the one with pen or camera in hand, recording, interpreting, and translating the native subject for the metropolitan audience. McDougall's aim was to acknowledge the fact of the encounter, to make of the film a conscious exchange as of interlocutors, rather than as a face-off between expert and subject specimen. But the slippage between I and we, back to I and we, is something to be tracked over the decades. Marlon Riggs's Tongues Untied was a groundbreaking performance, 1989, was a groundbreaking performance of selfhood, an autobiographical piece that brought Black, gay, male subjectivity to the screen in a way that blurred the lines between Riggs's own life and the experiences of myriad others, including poet Essex Hemphill, musician Steve Langley, and other members of Riggs's men's collective in the East Bay, that is Berkeley and Oakland. Made in the throes of the AIDS crisis, Tongues Untied is out to make a point that the details of one gay Black man's struggles against racism and homophobia and towards self-affirmation, no matter how forcefully depicted, are of less importance than the deeper rhythms, textures, and patterns of struggle shared by the collective. The film, even while narrating details of Marlon's boyhood crush on the boy with the gray-green eyes in Hephzibah, Georgia, never forgets its activist goals that require the breadth of communal engagement, that Black men loving Black men is the political act. The movement from I to we is accomplished by rendering the anecdotes of the many who share coordinates of gender, race, and sexuality interchangeable with one another. These Black gay men's tales are fluidly narrated and performed, overlapped and interwoven, so that Marlon's own story, foregrounded at the outset, never feels diminished or denied in the pivot to collectivity. Now, finally, I'd like to say a few words about a more recent film that enacts a logic of the supplement, and that is Time, from 2020, produced and directed by Garrett Bradley. Critic Amy Tobin has described Time, winner of the directing award of the 2020 Sundance Film Festival, as, quote, a first-person documentary. But the first-person storyteller in this case is not so much Garrett Bradley, the director, it is rather Fox Rich, or Sybil Fox Richardson, a Louisiana mother of 6 who for 21 years worked ceaselessly to have her husband, Robert, released from prison where he was serving a 60-year sentence without parole. In what sense is Garrett Bradley, she's the woman by herself on the right, award-winning director, not the author of the film? How can this be a first-person film, but it not be the director who won the award? The slippage in this instance is not between first-person singular and first-person plural, I, we, as in Tongues Untied, but in this case between first person and third person, I, she, between the one telling the story with Fox Rich, the woman on the left, and Garrett Bradley as twin enunciator subjects. And so conflict between first person, the one telling the story, and the one who serves as the object of that telling, with Fox as narrated subject. What makes Time exceptional is the existence of almost 100 hours of mini DV footage, the Richardson family archive, shot over an 18-year period. On the last day of shooting of what she thought would be a short film, Garrett Bradley had said to Fox, her subject, the charismatic wife, mother, social activist, and entrepreneur whose motto is, success is the best revenge. She said, okay, I'm going into the edit and I'll see you in 3 months. To which Fox replied, oh, hold on a second, I have this bag. At that point, Fox handed over a collection of black and white tapes, a moment Garrett describes as, quote, my worst nightmare and my biggest dream come true. What had been planned as a 13-minute short expanded into an 81-minute editorial tour de force, the collaboration of Bradley and editor Gabriel Rhodes, blending home movie footage with gorgeous black and white material shot by 3 professional cinematographers. Both the home movie footage and the new material is blended with, let's say, fluidly across nearly 2 decades of waiting and parenting and prison reform activism. The diarism of the Sybil Fox Richardson footage is made to coexist with the observational portraiture of the Bradley Garrett footage, an admixture sustained in no small measure by the pitch-perfect overlay of music by Ethiopian composer Imahoy. All of which strains to achieve what Bradley had intended for Time and also for others of her installation works, including a current solo exhibition at the Modern Museum of Art in New York, which is to say the mimicry of a 360-degree experience in which we live life. That's what she calls that. As for the first-person family material, some footage was shot by Fox herself in a fashion familiar from the feminist video diaries and video letters of the 1970s and 1980s. The work of Lynn Hirschman, Eileen Segalov, Susan Mogul, Joan Jonas, Martha Rossler. Tightly framed, confessional, at times brimming with unguarded emotion. She uses the camera to mark the days since her release from incarceration as an accessory to the burglary charges brought against her husband. Quote, "When I dropped my husband and his nephew off to rob a bank, immediately after they got out of the car, I knew we'd entered a world that we would never forget." But also she uses the camera as a means of intimate exchange with her husband. In lieu of pricey monitored phone calls into Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, Fox chose to send Rob, her husband, mini DV tapes that showed off her swelling belly. And I wish I had been able to capture individual images from the film, but I couldn't do it. It's available for streaming on Amazon. But she chooses to send Rob these tapes that show off her swelling belly. Twin boys, Freedom and Justice, conceived shortly before Robert's incarceration, while also testifying to her commitments to secure his early release and to remain devoted to him and their growing family. Other footage is shot point blank from behind the steering wheel of her car as she drives the boys to school or practice. And I would go back. I guess I'd have to go back to the very beginning, because one of the very first images on the opening slide shows her behind the wheel of the car. Still other footage is shot by her eldest son, Remington, at first only 7 years of age. These moments in the film can feel like small epiphanies or windows into the quotidian of everyday life for a single mother mourning an absent partner. They are deftly distributed across the 81 minutes of the film, in sufficient number to establish something like an autobiographical bona fides for the film. Time is an amalgam. It's a rare amalgam. Portraiture containing nested self-portraiture. It is a depiction that moves from inside to outside, from past to present, and across an astounding range of emotions without sacrifice of political cogency. Our prison system is nothing more than slavery, says Sybil Fox Richardson toward the end of the film. And I see myself as an abolitionist. In one scene, Fox, inquiring on the telephone as to her husband's parole status, is left on hold by an indifferent bureaucrat. In the course of just 3 minutes of screen time, she goes from deferential, powerless on the phone, to annoyed, to enraged and inveighing against a dehumanizing, racist system of mass incarceration, then back to a more managed affect suitable for a successful small business owner, which is what she is. The swapping out and blending of subjective sources and image types, the temporal swirl, and the vertiginous emotional valences on display throughout time render the filmic subject, Sybil Fox Richardson, a complex, fully fleshed out, irrepressible, and unforgettable woman, part source of the exposition, part subject of that exposition. In what I've said here, as I close, I've tried to indicate the ways that the logic of the supplement, developed by Jacques Derrida more than 50 years ago, a critique of the sign that sought to dislodge notions of speech and presence in favor of structures of writing and difference, has much to offer an analysis of the autobiographical film. The logic of the supplement places documentary truth claims in crisis and undermines Bazanian faith in the photographic sign by positing even the self-portrait as the external addition, at best a Lacanian mirror image. I've been interested in showing how Derrida's lucid account of writing can help us think more clearly about the limits of documentary's promise as nonfiction, its relationship to veridicality. One reason to focus on the autobiographical film is to see on display the vicissitudes or even impossibility of truth-telling, even for one's own life story, never mind for accounts of the lives and actions of others. Several autobiographical films have been considered, very different films, all of which puzzle over ways to tell stories of the self and that acknowledge the complex interplay of subjectivities alive in filmic self-portraiture. That's it. Thank you. Let me.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so now I need to.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, for this really thought-provoking lecture. I will be brief in my comments because I also want to let other people share their thoughts. But I have to say that I'm really intrigued by your suggestion to expand the understanding of the autobiographical in documentary through this logic of the supplemental. And you may want to respond afterwards or even accumulate some other thoughts as you wish. Let's see how it goes. I think that many here today were probably delighted, as I was, to hear the name of the late David Perlov, one of Israel's most esteemed documentarists and a former teacher in the school, as part of a respectful list of master participants in your talk, along with Marker, Mikas, and Ackerman. Now, remembering the differently creative attempts they all carried in order to be both in front and behind the camera at the same time, one cannot but be reminded here of Perlov's famous scene, 5 minutes into his seminal diary, where he contemplates whether he should film the soup his twin daughters are eating or join them in eating it. Such an elegant provocation does not encapsulate only an ethical dilemma about participating in the reality one is observing and potentially changing in making a diary, but maybe an early and unique attempt made by Perlov to occupy a double position of being present and absent at the same time, visible and invisible, operating the camera and erasing himself as its presumed holder simultaneously. To move inside and outside a diegetic space at the same time surely implies an essayistic position, but it is also part and parcel of a temporal gap. In Perlov, such a gap is created by filming the scene in 1973 and then editing it only 8 years later. Is such secondary revision, a process often discussed in relation to almost any diary film, related to personal cinema's therapeutic effects, the narrative and sound relate to the present while the images belong to the past. And the notion of the supplemental, I wonder, help us to understand better the nature of such a gap as an inherent characteristic of personal cinema. Now, speaking of the double Diane in Stories We Tell, composed of the real indexical home movie Diane and the staged material made by the actress playing her role, Professor Renov refers to Nichols' expression, body too many. Therefore, Professor Renov is able to, I think, cleverly avoid the pitfall of looking at Sarah Polley's film through the often heard accusation of misleading audience, and alternatively address this strategy of fabrication as a complex way to create a self-portrait that is vicarious, insinuating, duplicitous. I wonder whether we can speak in such terms about any reenactment in documentary, and more specifically, of course, in a diary film that creates such duplicity. A reenactment, as Nichols suggests, is an explicitly after-the-fact practice that is characterized with temporal belatedness, reclaiming an object in the past that is unattainable in the present. It is, as we know, an act of performance that replaces historical evidence with artistic interpretation, extending the voices of both the documentarist and the subject, whose replay always introduces a differential, a disturbance, as Ivoni Margulies reminds us, and which echoes nicely here with Derrida. History repeats itself only when penetrated with elements of fiction and performance that turn it via its reenacted representation into a different object. Professor Renov suggests that if we follow Derrida, contrary to Bazin's phenomenological model of a presumed indexicality between a sign and its referent, we are encouraged to never mistake a sign for referent or to assume a unicity of signifier and signified. I wonder whether such spectrality, assuming a difference with a surplus of meaning, can be traced not only within the documentary image, but also in relation to the voice. Any speaking subject in autobiographical film should be studied not merely as a carrier of a specific point of view, but as a harbinger of unintentional cues to the subject's psyche, a composition of different sonic properties, like the voice pitch, the tone, its timbre, that can teach us more than the words themselves. Such theorization of the voice obviously goes beyond Bill Nichols' understanding of it as simply a point of view or a social position, a theorization that he puts forward in The Voice of Documentary 1983, and regards it, as Annabelle Hones-Rowe and Maria Parmajoras so accurately describe in Vocal Projections, the recent anthology focusing on the voice in documentary, not merely as a platform for the dissemination of language, rhetoric, or story, but also as extra-linguistic expression that is just as likely to undermine truth claims as to uphold them. What is it, if not, in Professor Renov's words, a surplus of meaning, separate but indivisible? Finally, Professor Renov speaks of another spectral slippage of the voice by focusing on the movement from the first person singular to the first person plural, from the I to the we. The example of Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied from 1989 surely places such a performative act within the essayistic, collective outlook from a personal practice, but also bring to mind Catherine Russell's notion of autoethnography, which she lays out in the last chapter of her book, Experimental Ethnography. In films by Jonas Mekas, George Cukor, Sadie Benning, Kidlat Tahimik, or Chris Marker, autobiography becomes ethnographic at the point where the maker understands his or her personal history to be implicated in larger social formulations and historical processes. If ethnicity often refers to something inherited, fixed history of self, autoethnography in film destabilizes and disperses that history across a range of discursive selves. Through the concept of the autobiographical supplement suggested by Professor Renov, we can reread such process where the audiovisual medium functions as a means of splitting and fragmenting identity. Self-representation shifts onto something fluid and open, discursive and intertextual. And I'll end my really brief notes here to allow for further consideration. That if you would like to respond to this please do. And if not, we can accumulate more comments.
Yeah, let me just take a couple of minutes, but not much, because I'd rather hear everybody else. But the parallel is certainly a result of my several visits to Tel Aviv and to Israel, and the discovery, which I was helped. So I'm looking at some of the people on the screen here who recommended my looking at the parallel diary films, and it was quite a revelation and a wonderful thing. And I've written about it, and I've just he's in the pantheon for sure. And what you were saying, I love that reference to film the soup or eat the soup, because that is it attests to the kind of the limited character, the partiality of, and the kind of supplementarity at every move, at every moment, in the impossibility of getting it all, of being entirely equal to the task of being on both sides of the camera. And I would also just say that I love your comments about the sonic properties. And the one thing I would just comment on there is, on the if you look at Derrida in his original texts, voice comes out as the sort of bad object, because voice seems to be pure presence, as he describes it, and not based on trace structure, and therefore not incorporating this notion of difference, as he describes it, of graphology. That's why language as a writing practice is preferable, because philosophically defensible in a way that pure voice, pure truth of the truth isn't. But I would say that voice in cinema is another graphological practice. And I'm looking at Janet Walker here, partly because she's married to a guy who's been working on sound for many years professionally in Hollywood, film, and television. And you know, it is a writing practice, and it is something that it's not pure presence. It is so, and it's so acted upon. It is so, you know, call it manipulated or worked on. It is itself a kind of writing practice, and a very complex writing practice. So I think there's a lot to be said, just in kind of piecing together what the Derridian approach might be to thinking more fully about sonic properties. I think that's really interesting, but at least for me, it's super clear that it's not just voice as presence when we think about it in the cinematic context. And if you just think about if you just look at a strip of film, a mag film, and you see it is literally graphic. Now we don't see anything anymore because of the digital, but back in the day, I know when I was a student of Peter Kubelka back in the 70s, he would unspool Arnulf Reiner and have everybody hold on to it in the class, so that we could literally see how he had registered sound and image as pure sound, or you know, just white noise or absence of noise. We could see it as a writing practice with a certain pattern, a beat, a rhythm. And that was, he said, the kind of the essence of cinema for him. So I love that. And you know, I think those would be my comments for now. And I'd love to hear what other people have to say.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up for further comments. You can also just speak with your mic. You don't have to raise your hand or anything.
Hi, I would like to ask a question if I can. You were speaking about essay films, not only not only if the person is seen on the screen, but also if he's the one who captures or telling the story. So I was wondering, what is your opinion about films like Camera Person, or films like that, it's only about the gaze of the subject, but you never see the subject. You only see his way of seeing. I hope I understood.
Totally. Okay. Yuli it is?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, as you will notice that at some point, or maybe you didn't, but at some point I was trying to say, I don't want to just talk about autobiography. I want to talk about the autobiographical. That is to say, you know, it opens up, and the essay film, the way I've understood it and written about it, has always been that there is an that the essayistic, to go back to the Montaigne model of being both about a kind of a double action, the looking out and the looking in, always a kind of self-reflection. And self-reflection, which is about a kind of a registration of subjectivity. You don't have to be really on the screen. We know this. Although, so in other words, one's subjectivity can be inscribed, one's personhood can be inscribed through other means other than self-imaging. And to go back to, I mean, some of the gestural cinema of, say, Stan Brakhage, a film that I like to show a lot would be The Wonder Ring, which is very simple, kind of primitive, in which Brakhage over 6 minutes offers footage of the 3rd Avenue elevated train, which was soon to be demolished. And so he wanted to bring back footage as kind of evidence of something was about to be destroyed. And so one feels his presence, one feels, partly because it's handheld, but there's a marking of his own response to what he sees and to how he sees. Okay, so let's put that off to one side and talk about a Camera Person, because I think that's a wonderful example. I hope many of you have seen the film. I think it's an extraordinary film. And first thing to say is that she, meaning Kirsten Johnson, actually is visible in the film, not a lot, and she doesn't mark it as such necessarily, but she is present. But she's also present by means, in the very opening scene, by a sneeze, an off-camera sneeze. Achoo! A punctuation of subjectivity of a certain sort that's just delightful. And there are other moments in that film in which she's kind of scrubbing off the lens to get a clearer image. And so there are these interventions of her own, you know, agency as the camera person. But what's wonderful about that is that it's a treatise in certain ways of how one can take material shot for someone else and turn it into something that is truly autobiographical, or at least something like her own memoir, because she took a hand in she shot all this material. She is its source to a certain extent. It's taken completely out of context of how the material was used for the film. But it's a great example of how there's no such thing as an outtake. It's about what purpose the material, to what end the material gets used or repurposed. So in repurposing this material, she turns it into something like a journal of her own experience and her own ethical, her own passage through so many experiences, many of them in places of great physical danger and potential harm, and her ethical relationships with so many of these people who've been on the other side of her camera lens, and how there is this connection, deep connection, through empathy, call it what you want, but that the I, you, or the I, he, or I, she is very, very much the subject of that film. So I think it's a great example, and I think we could talk about that for a long time. But the essayism is a thing unto itself, and I don't want to say that that the essay film is entirely an act of autobiography, but the essay film, let's say, participates in the expression of subjectivity in important and complex ways. And it does absolutely overlap and intertwine with what I've been saying, I think.
Okay, thank you.
In the movie Fraud by Dan Fleischer-Camp, he takes videos from an American family that uploaded it to YouTube, and he edits it in a very extreme way and turning all the family home videos to kind of film like like a thriller. And I wanted to ask you about the notion where the director didn't was on set and he didn't took the footage, he only edits it. He puts his work in the editing way. What is the notion where he puts the supplement or whatever?
Well, I think, thank you. I haven't seen the film, but I certainly have seen plenty of other films, and I'm thinking of Jamie Barron, who's written so much about the appropriation of other people's work and the reappropriation, the reordering of this material and taking agency in that process of reappropriation, remix culture, etc. It's you know, it's ecological. It's about everything that we need to do in our environment, reuse, recycle, etc. And we endow new meanings every time we do that. So so in term, and I'm not sure how it relates exactly. I mean, certainly one's subjectivity is entailed deeply in such repurposing. And in a certain way, all of the material that one chooses, whether you shoot it, someone else shoots it, or it's even anonymous material, I mean, is endowed with your own imprint once you take it in your hands as plastic material and give it a new shape and a new life. Like, for example, you know, Agnes Varda's notions in The Gleaners and I, which is about what these people do who are picking up what seems to be someone else's refuse, but giving it this new breath of life and turning it into art, which is, and I think, a great figure for what all documentary does, and what this kind of heavily, whether it's taking this back to Esther Shub, right? In the very early years, in the 20s, the teens and 20s in the former Soviet Union, taking this archival material that people really hadn't looked at from the Tsarist period and endowing it with new meanings, making it a kind of communist effort, which could glorify the new regime. It's been with us from the very beginning. It's a very powerful way to think about subjectivity. And I would say one other thing, and I'm looking again at Janet Walker because she also went to UCLA for graduate training, and there for many years, one of the ways that they taught people how to make movies was to give them footage from outtakes from Gunsmoke and let them make their own little film using the outtakes so that everybody got to see that it didn't really matter what they gave you. You could turn it into film language and it would be your own. It could be your own. After all of that, I sit at home and watch old episodes of Gunsmoke.
Thank you.
Thank you for that thought, and it's very pertinent because of what we're living through currently. But I would say, I would mix together like someone like Marker, who had been present for so many struggles, moments of conflict throughout his life and career, and how he's able to take this material and also, similar to the way what Ohad was saying about Perlov, filtering it through his own retrospective knowledge of it. So because so much of what we see now is so-called live coverage. Derrida, by the way, would deconstruct that notion of liveness right there, but leave that to the side. But so often it's unfiltered and it's coming as close to real time as possible. But people like Marker had spent, a lifetime in reprocessing what they'd experienced and what they'd seen and what they'd known. Like The Last Bolshevik is a great example with Marker, thinking back to his relationships and his presence, his witnessing of moments in history and time and others throughout the 20th century. It's a piece that really looks at the entire 20th century. But now I want to say that in terms of activism and what's happening in the social sphere, so much of it is marked by this gesture of witness bearing that has to do with what we do with phones and what we do with the simplest devices for recording. And so I think it's really relevant to all of that. And so the question of the autobiographical, my God, it is all wrapped up in surveillance. It's wrapped up in ways that people have for being tracked and identified by placing themselves at sites of struggle, but also being placed and being tracked and monitored, which I know is happening in Israel in a very different way than it is happening in the United States. And we could talk about that really forever. And it has to do also with the pandemic and the ways of being, of subjectivity becoming a form of social, at least the markings of subjectivity as participating in forms of social control, either for good or evil. I guess I'll just leave it there because there's a lot that one could say on this subject, I think.
Thank you. Janet, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for holding this event. And thank you, Michael, for this a fascinating presentation as always. Just a word about sound. I do think there's a lot more to be said about sound from what my husband Steve has mentioned to me over the years. For example, there's something called sound perspective that he, as a production sound mixer, is always interested in getting. So the way you mic someone speaking needs to match the image track, even if the microphone is farther from the image. And so there's a lot of work to be done here, I think, by documentary scholars. And it's really fascinating. But anyway, that's not my question. My question is my same question as always. Mariana Hirsch once told me that I have an anxiety about the truth. And I appreciate that psychoanalysis that she was kind enough to offer, because I have an anxiety about the truth. And it's come up a lot in my, as I say, my own psychic structure, but also my scholarly work. And really, the trauma cinema is about the abject impossibility of discovering the truth of the matter. But I don't really agree with Errol Morris, who says the truth, there is such a thing as truth. It's just that it's hard to get at. I'm not so sure that there is such a thing as truth, but yet in this day and age, when the United States suffered a failed coup a few days ago on the basis of these lies about whether the election was fraudulent, it does seem really important to somehow deal with the truth of the matter. But yet, as Michael rightly says, we know that it's much more complex than that. So, and especially because we have these deep fakes now that are videos that look exactly like the reality of the situation, but in fact, they're computer generated. So I still have this anxiety about the truth. I think it's important to know. I think the iceberg is consoling, because yes, if, as you were saying, the unconscious, the greater part of psychic life is unconscious, and then you showed this iceberg, it would be great if we could be analyzing the mass and volume of the iceberg. That's my dream. But in reality, as you pointed out, it's much more complex than that. So in Stories We Tell, Sarah Polley could get some DNA evidence, right, and figure out who her genetic father is. And there are other situations where that's the case. But I gather your point is that that would not suffice in any case. So if you think of these other films where there's a combination of first-person footage that's unprofessional, and then professional footage like Trouble the Water or Capturing the Freedmans or Grizzly Man, which is the posthumous collaboration between the two. There are many times when you actually, even though you have all this footage, this filled up archive of footage, you just simply can't get at the salient ethical truths of the matter that I know you're interested in. So for example, in Capturing the Freedmans, did the father abuse the children in the computer class? Did his son abuse the children? You can never know that, not only because we don't have a time machine, can't go back in time, but also because of the definition of abuse being so variable. So I think, Michael, this is a really great explication of the way in which we absolutely must deal with the supplemental. And we can't only stop at the identification of something that's truthful. And I wonder and I guess my question is whether or not given my anxiety, whether or not it would nevertheless be interesting to somehow place the aspects that are discernible in productive tension with aspects that are not discernible. So for example, the DNA test in Stories We Tell, how would that serve? I know I obviously realize that it's not going to solve the problem, knowing or not knowing, but how can it work as a lever in relation to all these other vicissitudes of history and memory that you're alluding to? And how do the two play in together? Because it seems like your notion of the supplement gets at that very problem that I find so compelling. So I really want to know what you have to think about this.
Wow, great. I think we could have a very long conversation about this stuff. And I want to back up a minute to answer or to respond, to also say that there was this moment in the mid-90s, and it was in 1996, when there was this response to my work on documentary and to Bill Nichols and to Brian Winston, which was from analytic philosophers, American analytic philosophers, and Noel Carroll in particular, but it was echoed by others who said that those who took, the kind of stance that I've just been outlining, and as though we were, and they called it postmodern, that it was used as a kind of charge against, as though these were people who just didn't believe in truth at all, just didn't think it existed, and they were kind of know-nothings. And by contrast, Noel, whom I liked personally tremendously, and I hung out with him at a conference, one of the Tel Aviv conferences, and I like Noel, but I mean, just in what he wrote then in 1996, was a bit ludicrous, and it was reductio ad absurdum. But he would talk about the documentaries that he liked, which were kind of nature documentaries, and how much knowledge there was and how much information there was. So I think that one of the things so that's been a charge against a certain approach to thinking and writing about the documentary film through the lens of, let's say, Derrida et al., as being skeptical, postmodern, and I will accept the skeptical because I think that's fine. Postmodern, I don't even know what that means. So I'll forget that. But what I would say is, so this isn't a new problem within documentary studies, not at all. But what I would say is that there's a real difference between having a connection to evidence, which is what I think we need and what we feel so strongly has been absent, at least in the US, and I think in Israel and other places around the world, in terms of this assault. I wouldn't say assault on truth so much, though it may be that, I think truth becomes the sort of big name that masks lots of different things. I don't think there's anything wrong with holding on to an absolute attachment to notions of evidence. But let's distinguish between truth-telling and rhetoric, right? Let's say that what we're hoping for really is evidence to be gathered so that it could be persuasive. And but evidence of what? And evidence to what end? So to go back to stories we tell, there is DNA evidence in the film. There is some moment at which, you know, she knows it's 99.999. That in itself does not solve the problem. It's back to what I said in my comments, is that, you know, in what way does that piece of evidence dislodge the evidence of her experience of attachment and feeling that her father is Michael Polly, or the fact that her siblings had a sense of what was going on, or what hadn't ever been said to Sarah, but had never chosen to tell her. So there's so many different layers that the fact of whose semen it was that fertilized the egg of Diane Polly is only one small part of a much larger discursive web. So I think that what we all need is, I'm going to call it an attachment, a fidelity, a commitment to the gathering of evidence and to facticity. I'm not against facticity, but it's just that when you try to put it all together to make the 360, that notion of the 360 of getting everywhere, omniscience, of knowing it all, that's the fiction. That's what we have to guard against. And we can't, that slippage into that use of that language as though we can have it all. We ought to be aware that that's just not, that's not lucid. That doesn't hold up to scrutiny, but doesn't mean we let go of fact. Not at all. That we let go of evidence. No, not at all. And that's the way, that's what I would kind of back up and say. And that's just the beginning, but.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. More comments?
Sandra.
Sandra, yes, please. Sandra.
I would just like to add to Michael's last words, the difference between facticity and truth in relation to art. And I think that these are two different notions that we are talking about. And we have two things here. We have the, the analogy between spectrality and imaginary signifier, okay, that we can apply to film in general, not just to document. We have not just to subjectivity in documentary in general. And we have the more general notion of supplement and difference, and which leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And when we talk about art and artsy documentary, not just facticity, okay, that people take you in a prison and they show you everything that there's there to see. And even that, I mean, the question is, how much room do we have for interpretation? And the more room we have for interpretation, okay, the closer we get to this notion of the supplement, and the closer we are to art and art forms in documentary. And to my mind, what makes Polish film so artsy is that really a particular dimension of drawing your own desire into the film and addressing you as a spectator and asking you through her experience what your desire might be. With, for example, for Lacan, that it's the ethical subject, if you like. Okay, it's the question of desire. And also for her, you know, throughout the film, you see the film and you think, I mean, what does she want? What is she after, really? And that's a question that's not totally answered throughout the film. So it leaves you, as spectators, in the realm of desire, okay, in the realm of asking questions, another question, and another question, and another question. Ultimately, you have to turn the finger, you know, to you, you know, what am I as a subject, you know, what am I as a child, you know, what am I as a child to my mother? I mean, there's so many questions that this film raises. So, I mean, this is what makes it, you know, in my mind, a work of art, okay, not just facticity. So I would just, you know, draw the line between truth and fact, which in my mind are not synonyms, or not. And there's truth and there's art, and you know, you mentioned so many philosophers. I mean, Derrida, you know, has a truth in his writing. Buber certainly has a truth, a major one in his writings, and so on and so forth. So the truth has many colors, and it changes, and it has a deep connection to ethics. So I would, you know, maybe bring all these questions or notions into the discussion. The question of truth and fact.
Well, you know, we're just rehearsing the history of philosophy here, at least one branch of it. So we can't really do justice to it, but let me just, a couple of things you said that I'd like to respond to, Sandra. And one of them is facticity, because that was just to say, we don't let go of this notion that there are things that exist in the world that have impact and social value, and that we need to agree on. We need to have a consensus view towards. It's not meaning is not a free-for-all, which used to be the kind of critique of every kind of post-structuralism, like we'll never get anywhere. It's a free-for-all. I'm not saying that, but in fact, what I did say, I think, about stories we tell is that the truth is the truth of a certain level of opacity, and the opacity, therein lies a part of what, you know, artfulness, as you describe it, which is that the reason why the film has value and why people admire it, I think, is because in the process of realizing that she can't get to the bottom of it, what she does, her process in dealing with it and thinking about it, and the choices that she makes, the creative choices that she makes, and the kind of orchestration of all the elements for the film, something in that is very moving for many people, and unlocks a lot of these kinds of questions and desires and longings, you know, that we can share. But I had to really blend a lot of things. Buber, I tried to say that's back to metaphysics, but I felt like it was important to say that the slippage between first person singular, first person plural was, and first person singular and second person plural was also something important for documentary, as was the slippage between first and third. So, I mean, look, this is shorthand. But I do want to say one thing about Lacan versus Derrida, because they're not the same. They, in fact, you know, they fight a lot, but their ideas fight a lot, and in some ways they have a lot in common, though they probably wouldn't always admit it.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, just to go back to this one that for me really crystallizes it, and it is that I alluded to the postcard in this talk. And so the idea that being from Lacan, the postcard, the letter always arrives at its destination, would be something that Lacan would subscribe to. And Derrida's comment would always be, but it might not. You know, the postcard may not arrive at its destination. And I think so, maybe that's a level of abstraction not worthy of much discussion at the moment, but I really think that Lacanianism ends up coming back and saying, you know, here are the things that we can subscribe to and believe in, and the letter will always arrive at its destination. And Derrida introduces the doubt, but it may not. And that's one of the distinctions, the guardrails that I would use to distinguish between the two in their thought.
Thank you. That was really fascinating talk, Michael.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, I think.
Allison Ross with the question.
Allison?
Hello, I apologize for my lack of camera. I will be only a voice in keeping with our discussion of sound. So my question is about time. I'm thinking specifically about this concept of truth that we've been considering, and kind of the different valences of truth and fact. And thinking of fact as something that may happen in the moment and in the moment of the pro-filmic. And I'm wondering how that relates to not only kind of if the letter arrives, to continue the metaphor, but when the letter arrives. And if that changes the relationship that we might have as spectators and filmmakers to a truth and validity that's ascertained from the image.
Well, one of the things, thank you, Allison. One of the things that Derrida is really out to be very critical of is this idea that truth is as presence, and that it's kind of simultaneity. And so the idea that the gap between the signifier and the signified for him is really important as the critique of the sign. And so he would tend to say, I think the kind of classic Derridian position is that truth, capital T, tends to be thought of as something that happens all at once. That's why I had that image of, you know, all those of you who are here now at Mount Sinai and all those who have yet to be born, we're all here at the same time. It's as though that moment, that kind of presence, capital P, is a plenitude, and it is all encompassing, and it transcends time and space. That's the kind of truth that he's inveighing against. And then there are other kinds of truths. I mean, I think that one of the jobs that we have is to pluralize and get away from the capital T, which is as a construct doesn't hold up from this perspective, from this critical analytical perspective, but that there can be truths that maybe overlap with what we're calling facticity. But, you know, I would say that most people would say that the fact, if it is present and happening as a kind of small piece, maybe that's the Hayden White response as a kind of philosopher of history, who says that you look at a kind of threshold, you look at a horizon of fact, you look at all of the kind of the combination, the concatenation of different points of view and different perspectives, which is why he said, if you look at the Holocaust, or things that he says are holocaustal, they're overwhelming because of so many facts and so many perspectives and so many stories that can't fully be told, that one has to stand in awe of it and say, we can't do it. So that kind of completion, that sense of seeing it in the round as a whole, maybe is beyond the scope, but it doesn't mean that we can't assemble. This is why I say back to rhetoric. I think I feel much better standing on the ground of rhetoric, which is to say we take evidence, we take fact, and we look at it in a multi-perspectival way, hopefully. We see it and we allow for that which discounts the premise and that which supports the premise. And we look at it in lots of ways in such a fashion as to be, as to make it persuasive, which involves also psychoanalytic notions, because in order to be persuasive, we know through Aristotle that one of the ways we do this is by appealing to the emotion, appealing to desire. What is it that we need? What is it that we must, that we long for, all of that can help to make persuasive this assemblage of facts. But what I would say is that that's something it's not the same as this notion of this truth, which is a kind of false promise. And too often in the public discussions around truth, it's either truth or it's not true. And I just think that's what we as specialist people who think about this a lot, we really need to be out there making arguments about why that's inadequate. And it's sort of, let's place truth under erasure in the Derridian idea, which is it's necessary. We know we can't give it up. We know we need the word for whatever reasons, for all kinds of reasons, actually. It's necessary, but it's inadequate. And his notion, his gesture of suratur was, and it's Heideggerian, it's you mark it out, but it remains visible. You can still see through the marking. So you know, even while you're speaking it, that there's an inadequacy, but a necessity nonetheless. So I think that's where we need to be. And that's the kind of skeptical, philosophical stance that allows you to function in the world, but still know that you're dealing with, in common parlance, ideas, many of them that just don't stand up to scrutiny. This notion of truth as presence, as complete and absolute, as something that one subscribes to, believes in, has faith in. You know, there are very real and important limitations there, and that we should take into account. And documentary film, I think, helps us to understand that. And back to Sandra's comment about a lot of what we've been saying applies to all of cinema. Sure, absolutely, the imaginary signifier, all of cinema. But when it comes to, you know, films that seem to be the basis for judgment and for action and for politics, documentary plays a very large role in all of that, whether it's public service announcements or advertisements or political ads or whatever it might be. Trafficking in the truth, it's what we're all about these days. And I just think that we need to come to that trafficking of truth with a little more complex thinking. And I think Derrida helps us there. And I hate to be such a Derrida fan, but you know, but I think that he's got a lot to offer.
It's a very
I'm a fan.
hopeful way to end our conversation and the year. Thank you so much, Michael. It's been fascinating, and thanks for waking up so early for us.
I enjoyed it so much. As I said, it's Aliyah. You know, I'm feeling high, and
and hopefully we can do that here next time. And thank you all for joining us and asking these great questions. See you soon.